Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. Judgment is one of the oldest and most misunderstood human capacities. In the modern imagination, it is often treated as something crude, an act of condemnation, a failure of compassion, or an assertion of moral superiority. Mercy, by contrast, is cast as its moral antidote. Where judgment divides, mercy heals. Where judgment condemns, mercy forgives. This opposition, however, is neither necessary nor true. It arises from a deeper confusion about what judgment actually is. Historically, judgment was understood not as cruelty, but as the articulation of causal order in human life. To judge was to identify what preserves or destroys the conditions under which individuals, relationships, and societies can flourish. Justice, in its original and most life-sustaining sense, did not restrain judgment, it depended on it. Mercy did not negate judgment, it completed it. In classical Athens, judgment was a civic responsibility. Justice was not primarily inward or spiritual, but public and rational. Citizens were expected to reason openly about actions, character, and consequences, and to articulate causal relationships in the shared space of the polis. Athenian courts were not confessional theaters of intention, but forums of collective cognition. Even Socrates, so often misrepresented as a martyr of free thought, never denied the legitimacy of judgment itself. He contested its accuracy, not its necessity. His submission to the sentence was not obedience to error, but recognition that a society unwilling to judge at all would dissolve into incoherence. Athens understood that shared reality could only be sustained through shared judgment. Yet judgment in Athens was not blind severity. It was tempered by context, circumstance, and proportionality. Mercy appeared not as the suspension of law, but as discernment within it. A judgment without mercy would fracture civic trust. Mercy without judgment would dissolve the polis. Justice required both clarity and restraint, held together by reason. Rome carried this integration forward and embedded it in structure. Roman justice was less concerned with moral sentiment than with continuity. Law became the accumulated memory of causal learning across generations. Judgment was institutionalized through responsibility, precedent, and proportionality. The Roman citizen was judged not as a soul to be purified, but as an agent embedded in contracts, roles, and obligations. Mercy, when exercised, did not deny law, it presupposed it. Clemency was possible precisely because the law was strong enough to bear restraint without collapsing into arbitrariness. Judgment established responsibility. Mercy moderated enforcement. Together they preserved order across time. This structural integration explains why Roman law survived Rome itself. Its durability lay not in moral exhortation, but in fidelity to causality. Rome judged not to condemn, but to maintain the conditions under which civilization could persist. The American founding marked the last great synthesis of judgment and mercy in the Western tradition. Rejecting both theological authority and absolute monarchy, the founders grounded justice in natural law, an explicit recognition that certain causal relationships are inherent in human life. The Declaration of Independence lives on as a causal argument. When governments violate rights, legitimacy dissolves. Judgment here is neither personal nor arbitrary. It is structural. At the same time, the founders built mercy into justice through due process, proportional punishment, and the recognition of human fallibility. Liberty required judgment, but judgment, if it was to remain just, required mercy. A people incapable of judgment would require rulers. A system incapable of mercy would become tyrannical. Justice was conceived as a living balance between enforcement and restraint, grounded in reality rather than sentiment. The modern rupture occurs when this balance is broken. Christianity introduced a profound shift by internalizing judgment. Moral evaluation moved from public action to private conscience, from causality to sin. Judgment became spiritual suspect, associated with pride rather than clarity. Forgiveness was elevated, but severed from responsibility. Mercy became a moral absolute, detached from consequence. This softened cruelty, but at the cost of eroding causal enforcement in the human realm. Kant completed the transformation by abstracting judgment away from life altogether. In Kantian ethics, morality became duty divorced from consequence, procedure detached from flourishing. Judgment was no longer an articulation of reality, but an application of form. Context, development, and lived consequence was subordinated to abstraction. Mercy, in this framework, became irrelevant to justice, because justice itself ceased to be about preserving life and became instead about rule following. The result in contemporary culture is a strange moral paralysis. Judgment is equated with harm, correction with oppression. Mercy is demanded without responsibility. Accountability is resisted as cruelty. Yet causality does not disappear. Actions still generate consequences. When judgment is suspended, those consequences do not vanish. They arrive unmanaged. Mercy divorced from judgment becomes permission for disintegration. Judgment, when it appears, returns not as a justice, but as projection, moralism, and ideological scapegoating. What is lost is not compassion, but integration. Properly understood, judgment restores reality to the relational field of reconnecting action with consequence. Mercy preserves possibility by calibrating how that causality is enacted across time, capacity, and context. Judgment without mercy hardens into domination. Mercy without judgment dissolves into chaos. Integrated together, they form justice worthy of human life. To judge is not to annihilate a person, but to defend reality where it is denied. To be merciful is not to suspend standards, but to enact them proportionately so that connection strengthens rather than shatters. Mercy requires more integration than judgment alone, because it must hold causality without resentment, responsibility without vengeance, and consequence without annihilation. Athens judged to preserve shared reality. Rome judged to preserve continuity. America judged to preserve liberty through law. Our age resists judgment to preserve feeling and risks losing reality instead. Justice, if it is to recover its meaning, must recover judgment and mercy together, not as rivals, but as phases of a single interactive act. The preservation of the conditions under which human flourishing remains possible. In Integrative Developmental Therapy, IDT, judgment and mercy are not moral postures adopted by the therapist, but structural functions of integration enacted within the therapeutic field. Therapy is not a suspension of justice, it is developmentally calibrated form of justice whose aim is to the restoration of causal coherence within the self. The therapist does not judge as a moral authority, nor refrain from judgment as an act of compassion. Rather, the therapist embodies integrated judgment, allowing the client to internalize it through relational contact. In IDT, judgment first appears as causal articulation, not evaluation of worth. The therapist identifies and names the relationship between action and consequence, belief and outcome, avoidance and cost, integration and vitality. This is not accusation, it is reality restoration. Clients often arrive in therapy precisely because judgment has failed internally. Either it has been suspended, leading to disintegration and drift, or it has been distorted, leading to self-condemnation, projection, or rigid moralism. In both cases, causality is broken. The therapist's task is to reintroduce lawful judgment into the I relational field, where responsibility can be held without collapse. Only when a client can say this follows from that does agency return. Without this phase, therapy degenerates into reassurance without transformation. Mercy in integrative developmental therapy is developmental proportionality. Once causality is articulated, the therapist evaluates how judgment should be enacted given the client's developmental stage, integration density, nervous system capacity, trauma history, and current life conditions. Mercy appears as restraint, pacing, and timing. It prevents judgment from overwhelming the client's capacity to integrate. A truth delivered without regard for readiness becomes destructive rather than corrective. In this sense, mercy is judgment extended across time. Where judgment asks, what is true? Mercy asks, what can be integrated now? IDT explicitly avoids two common therapeutic distortions: mercy without judgment and judgment without mercy. In mercy without judgment, therapy becomes emotional shelter without causal articulation. The client feels validated but remains disintegrated. Responsibility dissolves and progress stalls. In judgment without mercy, therapy becomes confrontational or didactic. The client is overwhelmed, shamed, or prematurely exposed to truths that cannot yet metabolize. Both failures reflect misintegration in the therapeutic process itself. IDT insists that judgment and mercy must be integrated at every moment, not alternated arbitrarily. Justice in IDT is not punitive and not permissive. It is corrective and repetitive simultaneously. Judgment restores reality to the self. Mercy preserves the client's capacity to remain in relationship with that reality. This mirrors the civilizational arc traced earlier, but now enacted at the scale of a single life. The therapist functions as a temporary external regulator of integrated judgment, modeling what the client has not yet fully developed internally. Over time, this function is transferred inward. The goal of therapy is not compliance, insight, or catharsis, but the client's acquisition of lawful self-judgment guided by integrated mercy. When therapy succeeds, the client no longer requires the therapist's judgment because they can now judge themselves without collapse and extend mercy to themselves without evasion. The IDT model treats psychological health as a form of justice achieved within the self. Integration is the metric, flourishing is the standard, development is the context. In this framework, judgment without mercy fragments the self. Mercy without judgment dissolves the self. Integrated together, they form the ethical core of transformation. Thus, therapy becomes not a retreat from justice, but its most intimate and humane expression, the restoration of lawful causality within a life that can once again move forward. Justice, properly understood, is not a system of punishment nor social convention of approval or disapproval. It is the relational enforcement of causal order within the human domain. At its core, justice is the act by which an integrated consciousness preserves the conditions of life and flourishing against disintegration. Judgment is the operative mechanism by which this preservation occurs. Judgment is a law expressed in words and action. Laws, in their deepest sense, are not commands but principles of causation, statements identifying what follows from what. In the moral psychological domain, judgment articulates causal relationships between action, character, consequence, and the conditions required for human flourishing. To judge is therefore not to impose preference, sentiment, or power. It is to say, if this mode of action is permitted, these consequences will follow, psychologically, relationally, and developmentally. Justice is impossible without judgment because justice presupposes that causality matters in human life. A refusal to judge is not neutrality. It is the abdication of causal responsibility. Justice operates simultaneously across the three relational modes, I, thou, and I, it. And judgment is the connective tissue that keeps these modes integrated rather than collapsed or confused. I relation, self-justice. Judgment begins inwardly as the integration of one's own actions into a coherent causal narrative, Without self-judgment, responsibility dissolves and projection becomes inevitable. Justice toward others cannot exceed justice within the self. In I-thou relation, interpersonal justice, here judgment recognizes another as a causal agent. Agreement produces tacit judgment, confirmation without articulation. Disagreement makes judgment explicit, not as dominion, but as corrective orientation aimed at restoring shared causal reality. In I-it, institutional justice, judgment becomes formalized and procedural. Its purpose is not moral intimacy, but functional coherence. When improperly applied to I-thou, justice becomes dehumanizing. When absent from I-it, justice becomes arbitrary or sentimental. An integrated system of justice knows which relational mode it is operating within and judges accordingly. The conditions of life that dominate one's development shape the criticality of judgment, the threshold at which causal violation demands response. Scarcity, instability, and exposure to disorder lower tolerance for causal breach because the cost of error is existential. Stability and abundance permit greater latitude because the system can absorb deviation. This does not relativize justice, it contextualizes it. Justice remains objective because its standard is invariant, the preservation of the conditions required for integration and flourishing. What varies is not the law, but the urgency of its enforcement. Justice is distorted when the intensity of judgment exceeds the density of integration in the judge. In such cases, judgment becomes moralism, projection, or coercion, force substituting for understanding. Conversely, justice collapses when density exists but judgment is withheld. Here, fear of conflict erodes causal articulation, enabling disintegration through permissiveness. This yields a core principle of justice as integration. Justice is valid when the intensity of judgment is proportional to the density of the judge's integrated understanding and the objective stakes of the context. The most integrated judges often appear restrained. Their authority lies not in volume, but in causal inevitability. Their words carry weight because they express reality, not reaction. To judge is to enact principled causation onto unprincipled behavior. Unprincipled behavior is not merely immoral, it is causally blind, fragmented from consequence, time, and responsibility. Such behavior introduces entropy into the relational field. Judgment intervenes by restoring the broken link between action and consequence. It says, in effect, causality still applies here, even if it is denied. In this sense, judgment is not violence against the person, but defense of reality within the relational field. It protects the integrity of self, other, and system simultaneously. Justice, then, is neither retribution nor tolerance. It is the maintenance of integrated order across persons, relationships, and institutions. Judgment is its instrument, not as condemnation, but as clarification, not as domination, but as orientation toward life. Where judgment is absent, justice decays. Where judgment is unintegrated, justice becomes tyranny. Where judgment is proportionate, justice becomes the quiet strength that allows human flourishing to endure. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.